Hi everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of our Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde GCSE revision series. If you haven't been paying attention to this series so far, we've been covering all of the characters and themes in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, loads of key quotes, model answers and paragraphs so that you can do the best that you're able to within your GCSE exams, whether you're sitting them this year, next year, the year after. So far in the series, we've done a lesson on Utterson, a lesson on Jekyll, and a lesson on Hyde, and a lesson on Lanyon. So if you need any help with any of those characters, definitely consider watching those previous videos. Today, we're going to be covering good versus evil in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So looking at good versus evil today. So diving straight in, I love this picture. It's such a silly picture, but I love it. Just Jesus wrestling with Satan. Anyway, so there are a few things that I need to talk about in terms of how you would form points or ideas about good versus evil. And then once we've done that, we'll go into some quotes. And today, actually, we're going to do a longer extract, because for most of you, most people doing Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, it will be an extract-based question. And even if you don't have an extract-based, just going through a little bit of a chapter, going through looking for some language and structure on good versus evil, I think is beneficial for everyone. So that's what we'll do. And then we'll finish with, if we have time, a few just general quotes, and then a model paragraph like usual. So the good character within Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde really is Mr. Utterson. We've spoken about that before. We've also spoken about, just skipping down a bit, how Freud's work is often kind of thought about when you think about this text. So you've got the id, the ego, and the superego. I've shown pictures of what that looks like in previous videos, but effectively the id is like your impulses and your desires, regardless of whether it hurts other people or whatever. So that's Mr. Hyde. The ego is trying to balance the superego, which is your morality, like the best part of you and the worst part of you. So it's trying to balance good versus ego. So that's really more Dr. Jekyll. And then the superego is just your good, noble, best version of yourself. So that is pretty much Mr. Utterson in this novella, if anyone could be said to be the superego. Honestly, I'm not sure that they could, because even Utterson is a blend of good and evil, same as any other person. And that's really the biggest thing we want to talk about when we talk about good versus evil. We want to talk about the fact that every human being that's ever lived is a blend of good versus evil. And so Dr. Jekyll is just a good example of how, if you repress your desires to do certain things, then it can come out in very ugly ways. So that's really what this is all about. He wants to do evil things, but he's got so much pressure on him to be a Victorian gentleman, to do everything right all the time, that this, as I say, links really to his repression. He's never allowed to have any fun whatsoever. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that anyone should be allowed to like get really, really drunk, do loads of drugs, harm other people. Obviously, that's always going to be evil. But the problem with Dr. Jekyll is he was never even allowed to have like a drink, really, or, go and do that one silly thing that's not actually hurting anyone. He was so repressed in his life that he never got to do anything. And that's the unhealthy consequence of this. Because he was forced to be perfectly good all the time, it brings out that most evil side of him through that repression. This also then forms a moral message, basically, within the novella. One of the things that I tell a lot of my students is that Jekyll and Hyde it was incredibly popular, believe it or not, with churches. So priests and preachers and people like that would buy copies of this, encourage their flocks, their congregations to read this, because there is a moral message about, if you push yourself too far with repressing everything, then it can actually have really bad consequences. And then there's also, I suppose, a deeper message which links to good versus evil, which is that Dr. Jekyll basically becomes addicted to doing evil things. He's addicted to Mr. Hyde, to being Mr. Hyde. And that's really an addiction to evil. And so then when you're addicted to something, you end up potentially hiding things from other people, trying to deceive them, that sort of thing. And that's probably why he's called Mr. Hyde, because you're literally hiding all of these things you don't want people to know about you. And that was really popular within the churches to sort of show, look, everyone is this blend of good and evil. You can try and do this on your own strength, but really everyone is going to have these problems, and it's best not to hide them and to try and face them. So there are a few sort of contextual things that we can add in when we're thinking about good versus evil as well. So we've already talked about Victorian gentlemen. Industrial Revolution, this was a time in history where certain people in power, particularly wealthy, upper class, factory owners, that sort of thing, were given an opportunity to do more damage than pretty much anyone in history up to that point. They were able to more or less enslave their workers and to repress them. So the repression that we see in the novella might be reminiscent of some of the oppression that we see within Victorian society through the Industrial Revolution. This class division also allowed for more separation of good versus evil. So imagine there are a few references in the novella to sort of the working class people, and they're sort of slumped in door frames and drinking gin in the mornings and that sort of thing. So that just gives us a little picture of like how bad the situation had got in England or in United Kingdom generally. Because of this division, we had these super wealthy Victorian gentlemen like Utterson and Jekyll and Lanyon and so on, and then we had these poorer people that had almost nothing, so they'd almost given up. And then what's really interesting is we also have these Victorian gentlemen swooping into that working class, it's not a subculture, but that working class environment to sleep with prostitutes, to drink alcohol, to smoke opium, all that sort of thing. So there are definitely some ties to good versus evil in terms of the Industrial Revolution and class division. We've already talked about Freud's work. It can also definitely link, I think, to Darwinism. And then I'll go a bit further out, something that's more, maybe a little bit more tenuous, but something you could explore and think about that is going to be something that less students will talk about, is colonialism. So Darwinism, this idea that we evolved from apes, and obviously when you look at an ape or different types of primates, they don't necessarily really display the same level of morality that we do. They are willing to be vicious and attack each other over territories and steal from each other, steal food and resources from each other, that sort of thing. Certain primates are really vicious, that kill each other, that sort of thing. So we look at that in the natural world, and then Darwinism suggests that we are actually really part of that animal kingdom and that chain. And so then a lot of Victorian writers were sort of exploring that. Well, does that mean that really that's us too? Are we really the primates, but just sort of a bit more masked, a bit more repressed, a bit more, able to maybe control ourselves slightly better? So there's a lot to do with good versus evil there. This idea that maybe in our internal origins, we are more evil than Victorian society allowed us to show, that sort of thing. And we have these instincts and desires that were being crushed. So that's Darwinism. And then finally, colonialism. This is an interesting one to ponder for a bit. So what Mr. Hyde does when he's doing all of these evil things is he's sort of crushing the little guy, basically, or the little girl, literally, right? Trampled calmly on the little girl. Sir Danvers Carew, this older, frailer gentleman, Mr. Hyde has no mercy and just beats and destroys him and kills him, clubs him to the earth. Now, that doesn't directly necessarily link to colonialism, but it's this idea that a more powerful person, more vibrant, powerful person is effectively, trampling on and crushing down a more vulnerable population or person in the population. And that's really, in essence, a chunk of what colonialism did, right? So it's a very complex thing. I'm not a historian. Of course, when Europeans went to all of these other parts of the world, they didn't literally go just to kill everyone. That's sadly what ended up happening in a lot of places and a lot of cultures. They went to take from the native peoples. If the native peoples complained, that's when aggression often happened, which is terrible. But effectively, in a nutshell, what I'm saying is you could argue that colonialism was this unrepressed way of trampling on people more vulnerable. And here we see Mr. Hyde, a stronger person, trampling on the more vulnerable. So that's an interesting link you could explore more. I don't really have time to go any deeper into that, but hopefully you get where I'm going with that. Okay, so let's look at good versus evil now. We're going to read this longer extract, and then I'll give you some thoughts from the extract. So, I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through, his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. So he's basically saying here that when other people that have other vices, other addictions, think about those addictions, they probably don't really, they sort of repress the damage they're doing to themselves or others because of their addiction. And he's effectively saying that that was the same thing. He doesn't really think about the complete moral insensibility and insensate readiness to evil, which were the leading characters of Edward Hyde. Now, the reason that we know this is because Edward Hyde is literally meant to be this abstract idea, really, of the most evil part of us embodied in a human-like form. I wouldn't say that Hyde is exactly human, but humanoid. So this is linking to what I was saying about the addiction of evil in Dr. Jekyll, the fact that he is ultimately addicted to becoming Edward Hyde, and he doesn't care about the consequences any more than a drunkard cares about the consequences when they get drunk and hurt people and hurt themselves. Yet it was by these that I was punished. And there's an irony to that then. So he knows that the evil that Hyde does will end up punishing him and biting him in the backside, but he still does it in the same way that if you're addicted to alcohol or drugs or something, you know that there will be pain that is created by that, and that pain will punish you at some point. But if you're addicted, it's very difficult, I would imagine, to stop. So we feel maybe a little bit of sadness for Dr. Jekyll. My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred in my soul that tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least before God, no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no more reasonable spirit than that in which a sick child may break a plaything. Now, that's a really scary metaphor. So basically, Jekyll is saying that when he is Hyde, his ability to kill is like a child breaking a plaything. So, you know, when a child hasn't really developed a full morality yet, because they haven't developed yet. So if a child grabs a toy and smashes it around and breaks it, it doesn't think it's doing anything wrong or think about the consequences because it's a baby, right? Or a small child. And in the same way, this is talking about Sir Danvers Carew being killed. When Mr. Hyde was beating the living heck out of Sir Danvers Carew and killed him and literally broke a club on him, that's how hard he was beating him and stamping on him, right? He didn't care. It was like a child throwing a toy around. So talk about evil. And yet we don't get a sense that he understood that until he then wakes up as Dr. Jekyll and realizes what he's done. So when he's Mr. Hyde, he doesn't have any sense of morality at all. He doesn't have it. So that's quite an interesting quote there. I think that I love this quote. I've talked about it before. My devil had been long caged. He came out roaring. So the imagery of that has changed a lot. So at the beginning, Mr. Hyde was like a stain of breath upon a mirror. So, you know, you like breathe a little breath on a mirror and you can just wipe it off and it's gone and there's no consequence, right? Whereas this here, the devil had been long caged. This is a problem. This is someone like caged up. So they're constantly a threat of coming out. So we see how evil is growing here through this novella as well. Evil is getting stronger and stronger while good is getting weaker and weaker. And we've spoken about why that is as well. Dr. Jekyll is a blend of good and evil. So someone who's part good, part evil is not going to be able to eventually overcome and overthrow someone who is fully evil all the time. It's just not going to happen. So there's that. So I had voluntarily stripped myself of all those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness among temptations. In my case, to be tempted, however slightly, was to fall. So this again is just the extremity of evil. Even the slightest temptation is enough to totally ruin Dr. Jekyll when he's Mr. Hyde. Instantly, the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged. So the connotations of hell as well, this idea that what he's really doing when he wakes up Mr. Hyde is he's actually waking up hell. He's waking up not necessarily a literal sort of religious view of hell, not necessarily, but maybe more of an abstract view of hell. He's creating hell on earth through his choices, because if you have everyone pure evil, you are creating a hell, right? You are creating a place where no one is safe, no one is kind to one another, there's no joy, there's nothing but pain and sorrow in that place. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow. And it was not till weariness had begun to succeed that I was suddenly, in the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. I just like that word mauled because it has those connotations of Darwinism. It's very animalistic, you know, like a lion will maul its prey. It's a predator-prey kind of image. So the fact that it's used here, that links to Darwinism, which I said before, this idea that the most evil part of us is probably quite animalistic. And so that link between Darwinism, animalistic imagery, and then this idea that the most evil part of us is maybe from a primitive origin. Okay, keep reading the extract. A mist dispersed, I saw my life to be forfeit and fled from the scene of those excesses, at once glorying and trembling. My lust of evil gratified and stimulated, my love of life screwed to the topmost peg. So that's really messed up. So basically, Dr. Jekyll was saying that in killing Mr. Hyde, he actually, in killing Sir Danvers Carew as Mr. Hyde, he feels that he's peaked in his life. This is his favorite thing that he's done in his life. He's achieved something terrible, which is murder, and yet to him, this is the best moment of his life. So that just tells you how deeply evil Hyde is and how really deeply evil Dr. Jekyll is in his repressed state. He spent all his life looking after people as a doctor, and yet there's this secret desire to kill. What it reminds me of as well is at the beginning in chapter 1, there's the sawbones turned sick and pale with a desire to kill Mr. Hyde. So it plays with this imagery or this idea that maybe even doctors who have taken a Hippocratic oath to help people, maybe sometimes they have these urges to do harm to people. Yeah, obviously their entire life's work is to heal and help people. Interesting thought. I ran to the house in Soho and, to make assurance doubly sure, destroyed my papers. Thence I set out through the lamplit streets and, in the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloated on my crime, lightheadedly devising others in the future. That's another thing about the sense of evil here. Evil doesn't ever get satiated. It keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And that's what happens with Mr. Hyde. And yet still hastening and still hearkening in my wake for the steps of the Avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing him before Henry Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen upon his knees and lifted his clasped hands to God. So we've got this sense that so this is now going back to the good side to some extent, right? When Jekyll comes back and we get this sense of morality back again, like a human morality, because most normal humans obviously don't want to kill each other. Maybe we get angry with each other and in the moment we feel like we want to hurt each other, but deep down, most of us don't want to really deeply harm people or kill people. If we do, we end up in jail, obviously, because you can't have that. But so Jekyll comes back, the imagery of him streaming with tears, falling on his knees, clasping his hands to God. This is another big theme within the novella. It's the theme of sort of religion, God. So Jekyll is kind of asking for help here. And again, this might be part of why preachers and people like that love this book so much, because in the worst moments, these characters do cry out to God. So Dr. Jekyll cries out to God here. Dr. Lanyon cries out to God when he sees Mr. Hyde transforming to Dr. Jekyll. He says, oh God, right? Not sure about Mr. Utterson, but Mr. Utterson really doesn't need, he's never really in that bad of a situation. But I still think he might exclaim it once or twice. Anyway, the veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot. I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of childhood when I had walked with my father's hand and through the self-denying toils of my professional life. So that is exactly what I was saying about how Dr. Jekyll has been repressed his whole life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the damned horrors of the evening. I could have screamed aloud. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed against me. So again, this is this idea that Dr. Jekyll is the ego. He's not the id. It's overwhelming to him to see the evil that Mr. Hyde has done. And still, between the petitions, the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it was succeeded by a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible, whether I would or not. I was now confined to the better part of my existence. And oh, how I rejoiced to think of it. With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of natural life. With what sincere renunciation I locked the door by which I had so often gone and come, and ground the key under my heel. Now that answers a little question, because when Utterson and Paul go into the cabinet in chapter 8, the last night, they find a key that's been ground up. They don't know why. It's because Dr. Jekyll sincerely tries to stop being Mr. Hyde after he kills someone, after he kills Sir Danvers. Now, part of the rest of the tragedy is the fact that even though he sees how evil Mr. Hyde is, even though he can't bear what he's done as Mr. Hyde, now that he's got his human morality back, even though he tries his best, what happens? In a moment of weakness, he drinks the potion again. I was going to say poison, it kind of is poison. He drinks that again and he becomes Mr. Hyde again. And that's the tipping point where then he can't control becoming Mr. Hyde. Okay. So there's an extract, loads of things in there. We've covered repression, we've covered Darwinism, we've covered Victorian gentlemen, we've covered the id and the ego, we've covered several kind of interesting quotes generally. So quite a lot of good things in there. Let's try, unfortunately, I don't have time to go through these quotes on top with you. But what I would say is, well, let's just really quickly. So all human beings are commingled out of good and evil. So, this is linking to the ego. An ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman opened the door. She had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy, but her manners were excellent. So that's an interesting little moment, because you can have someone who's very evil, but in the Victorian times, they can mask it with being a Victorian lady or a Victorian gentleman. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid restraint and plunged in shame than when I laboured in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge and relief, or the relief of sorrow and suffering. So at the beginning, Jekyll was saying, I enjoy being good sometimes, but I enjoy being evil sometimes. So it's, again, that's just the ego, that's the human condition. Jekyll had more than a father's interest, Hyde had more of a son's indifference. I've spoken about this quote before. Basically, the metaphor of that shows that Jekyll was going to lose, because Jekyll's putting more into the relationship, so to speak, of Mr. Hyde and him. Hyde doesn't care about Jekyll at all. Okay, so let's do a model paragraph. What is the significance of good versus evil? We're going to do point evidence, technique explanation, reader response, and then context. Same as usual, and same as usual, I haven't given myself much time to do a model for you here. So good versus evil is a theme which Stevenson uses throughout the novella to convey the difficulty of the human condition when considering morality and moral choices. So what you want to do with every paragraph you write is you want to make sure that the point is very specific. So that's a very specific point. We're going to look at how good versus evil shows this kind of struggle in the human condition. I think I'm going to link this to, link it to the id and the ego and the superego. So Freudian thinking. You could link this to Darwinism. You could link this to Victorian gentlemen. All of those contexts would be okay. So we see this through the analogy of, let's take this one first. Jekyll had more than a father's interest. Hyde had more than a son's indifference. The juxtaposition of interest that Jekyll gives to Mr. Hyde versus the lack of interest that Hyde has for Dr. Jekyll ultimately forebodes that evil will win in the end, since a man that is a blend of good and evil is trying to control a being which is fully evil. We also see this in the reactions of the two characters from the murder of Sir Danvers. Where was that quote? Whilst Stevenson uses the metaphor, or sorry, the simile of a sick child may break a plaything when describing how Mr. Hyde feels whilst he savagely beats and kills Sir Danvers. Jekyll is described as having tears, or as streaming tears. The imagery showing his great remorse at the actions of Mr. Hyde. Despite all of this, we see that the human condition struggles to stay moral, since Dr. Jekyll does ultimately go back to being Mr. Hyde. As the reader, we may feel some empathy for Dr. Jekyll. He is addicted to his evil, partly because he was so repressed as a Victorian gentleman. So I did end up using Victorian gentleman as well. This is significant when you consider that the novella was written close to the time that Sigmund Freud proposed, actually, still a theory, the theory of the id, instinct, ego, negotiator, and superego. Since Mr. Hyde is clearly the id, and Dr. Jekyll is the ego. Okay, it's a pretty good paragraph. I'd have liked to have put a bit more analysis, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for. So I hope that's helpful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please comment below. I'll see you in the next one.